All right, everybody. I wanted to do a very quick response to someone that has offered to prove the existence of objective morality and God in just under 4 minutes. This is the channel No Assembly Required. So let's have a look at the video. And yeah, let's just get right into it. And I'll certainly have something to say about this.
One of the simplest and most common arguments for the existence of God, and one of my personal favorites, is the argument from morality, which usually goes something like, okay, an objective moral law cannot exist without an objective moral legislator, right? Like every law has to have a lawgiver. Objective morality exists, therefore God exists. But a common mistake that a lot of people fall into when they're making this argument, and that I myself have made in the past as well, is they fall into an argument of circularity. Because a lot of times atheists will ask the question, okay, well, how do you know that morality is objective? And a lot of people's answer to that question is something along the lines of a law is written on everybody's hearts, right? Like everybody knows what is right and what is wrong. And while that's not necessarily untrue, it ultimately becomes a circular argument, because the only way that you can know that something like, murder is wrong is because God told you that murder is wrong, right? And so what you're ultimately saying is, okay, murder is wrong, therefore God exists. But the proof that murder is wrong is that God exists. So it assumes the conclusion within the premises, which makes it a circular argument, right? But I think
So you might be right about that. There could be ways in which people structure an argument in a circular way. I'm not that interested in that possibility. So if he's right that people are using circular arguments, they shouldn't. They don't have to, though. Just as a general point about people claiming that the law of God is written on our hearts, even if that were true, it wouldn't follow that therefore realism is true. Not that he's necessarily saying that here, but people will sometimes say that sort of thing. Well, they'll say, "Oh, I'll ask, are there passages in biblical scripture supporting moral realism?" And people will frequently appeal to that one. And I find that puzzling. If God inscribed in our hearts, and of course, that's like intended to be metaphorical. If people are psychologically predisposed to hold certain sorts of moral beliefs, values, or standards in virtue of the way in which we are structured psychologically or more generally as beings, that would not necessarily make us realists about those issues, nor would that require there to be objective moral facts in some general sense. For comparison, it is perfectly reasonable to think that whether you think God made us or whether we're a product of natural selection or some combination thereof, that that we have a certain innate predisposition towards certain kinds of food preferences. And it doesn't have to be specific foods. Maybe whether you like spicy food is going to be highly culturally contingent, although there might be heritable elements of that. But just take something like a general preference that we have for sweet things or things that are savory or things that are sour. Certain aspects of human food preferences are going to be arguably like inscribed on our palate. But the fact that we have an innate predisposition to have certain sorts of food preferences doesn't mean that those food preferences are objectively correct. It would just mean that we're predisposed to have them. Likewise, the fact that God created us in such a way, I don't actually think this is a fact, but conditional on this being a fact, if God created human beings in such a way that they had a disposition to hold certain moral values or have certain sorts of moral beliefs, that wouldn't necessarily make those attitudes or beliefs objectively or stance independently true. So it's a bit strange when people cite that as a rationale for moral realism. Now, if they want to say, but God inscribes on us knowledge of the truth, even that's not going to be good enough. That's actually consistent with relativism and constructivism. So what you would have to say is you'd have to somehow interpret the passage as God gives us knowledge of the objective moral truths. And it's not at all clear that the passage says that. So I would still want to see some other scripture if there were a biblical basis for moral realism, which, as an aside, I haven't seen a strong one. But I'm not a Bible scholar, and I don't really study a lot of Christian philosophy, so I wouldn't know. But I've been skeptical of this because I really haven't seen any clear indication that scripture supports moral realism. So maybe this is something that they could speak to if they end up responding to me. Okay, let's keep going.
I've actually found a quite simple way to prove the existence of an objective moral standard, and it doesn't use any circular arguments at all. It just uses the simple process of elimination. So really the argument is that objective morality must exist because it can't not exist. There are four possible conclusions that we can come to. Morality either has to be subjective, objective, both, or neither, right? And we can go ahead and cross out the both option because it just doesn't logically make sense, right? Like murder cannot be wrong and not be wrong at the same time. That just violates the law of non-contradiction. So we can go ahead and cross that one out. But now let's move on to subjective morality. And what's interesting about subjective morality is it actually has a circular pitfall as well, right? Because the only standard for which you determine what is right and wrong is your own personal preferences. So, for example, a line of dialogue could go something like, okay, well, why is murder wrong? And a subjectivist would answer, because I think it's wrong. Well, why do you think it's wrong? Because it's wrong. And we fall into a similar pattern.
So this is a problem here. He has not shown that subjectivists require or lean on any type of circularity for their position. I mean, a couple things. First of all, an appropriate contrast here, objective and subjective are not like a dichotomy. Now, he does include that it's neither. So he's not technically presented us with a false dichotomy. But you could endorse a variety of positions according to which moral facts are stance dependent that don't reduce to it being dependent specifically on your preferences. So you could think that moral facts are, you could endorse the view that the what's morally right or wrong for you to do is what a fully informed and ideally rational version of you would endorse. Or you could think that there would be a single standard that all fully informed and ideally rational agents would converge on. So you might endorse something like ideal observer theory, and that's still going to give you a type of stance dependence. You could be a cultural relativist, and you could think that what's right or wrong is relative to your culture. That wouldn't be a type of objectivism or a type of subjectivism in the sense he's indicating here, which is localized to the individual. This also doesn't really address the distinction between agent and appraiser relativism. So there's a degree of simplification here that's understandable in a lot of argumentative contexts. And if you include a neither, then you've got your bases covered in terms of listing off all the logical possibilities. But that's going to be a problem once we move to that neither category, because if you want to use the process of elimination, you're now going to have to refute every single position that belongs in the neither category, which is going to be cultural relativism, constructivism, ideal observer theory, any relation designating account. So this is going to be quite a big grab bag of miscellaneous views, and I don't think he's going to be able to do that in 4 minutes. And so I don't think that's really going to work. But the other thing is just that subjectivists, if you can create a dialogue where a subjectivist says things that are circular or empty or vacuous, but that doesn't mean that subjectivism is like intrinsically circular or vacuous in terms of what it's saying. So if you're a subjectivist, you could think a few things. So if you're some sort of analytic subjectivist, you might, and you're using the contemporary analytic reason-based account of things, you might think something like this. On this view, there are no stance-independent facts about what's morally right or wrong. So there's no facts about what's right or wrong that are not dependent on or determined by our desires. Instead, to the extent that there are moral facts, all of those moral facts are fully determined by what our desires are, that the desires determine or make true the propositional claims that we make about what's morally right or wrong. So that when a person says something like stealing is wrong, that would be best understood to say something, to mean something like, I disapprove of stealing, or stealing is inconsistent with my moral preferences, something like that. And then those statements would be true in that sense. So if it is in fact true that I disapprove of stealing, and then I say I disapprove of stealing, the statement is true. And so as long as the subjectivist analyzes your sort of typical first order moral propositional claim in terms of that subjectivist analysis, the claims end up being trivially capable of being true or false. Now, if someone says, but why do you think that? What are they asking for at that point? So in other words, you have this dialogue, right? So, hey, do you think stealing is wrong? Yes, I think stealing is wrong. Why? Well, let's take a look at exactly what he says, because I'm not seeing why they would have to respond in a way that's circular.
But now let's move on to subjective morality. And what's interesting about subjective morality is it actually has a circular pitfall as well, right? Because the only standard for which you determine what is right and wrong is your own personal preferences. So, for example, a line of dialogue could go something like, okay, well, why is murder wrong? And a subjectivist would answer, because I think it's wrong.
Yeah, so that's already a little weird. So why is it wrong? Because I think it's wrong. So in that sense, what they're saying is, well, I disapprove of it. So that's just going to be true. And no further justification would be needed at that point. There's no circularity there.
Why do you think it's wrong? Because it's wrong.
All right.
Wrong. And we follow.
So why do you think it's wrong? Because it's wrong. So once at that point you ask, why do you think it's wrong? That's an ambiguous question. Is the question, when you say, why do you think it's wrong? Is the request a request for a justification, like some sort of philosophical defense of why you think that it's wrong? Or is it a request for a causal explanation. Like if somebody says, why why do you live in Nebraska? There would be some causal story that you could say for, well, here's how I ended up here. But if somebody says, no, why don't you move? You don't even like living there. You'd say, oh, well, because I get paid well to live here. So those are different sorts of accounts that you could give. One would be a sort of normative justification that accounts for what's motivating you to do this sort of thing. And the other is just like a sort of causal account. So when you say, why do you think that? So the exchange goes like, are you against stealing? Yes, I'm against stealing. Okay, but why are you against stealing? At that point, these subjectivists, if you're asking them for a justification, they're not obligated to offer one. That's not circular. It'd be the same as if you're a subjectivist about color preferences. So my favorite color is purple. That's obvious. I have purple light on me right now. Well, it's on this side. So why do I like purple? Like if someone said, okay, but what's your justification for liking purple? Can you give an argument for why purple is the color that you ought to prefer? This is a nonsense question. It's just a descriptive fact about me that I have that preference. And the same would hold true if you're subjectivist about moral values. You just have the moral standard. It doesn't call for a justification. It would be a kind of category mistake because the fact that, for instance, you disapprove of stealing is just a descriptive fact about your preferences. It doesn't require a justification any more than you're required to offer a philosophical defense of the fact that you dislike cilantro or you like vanilla ice cream more than chocolate ice cream. Those just aren't the sorts of things that call for a justification conditional on subjectivism. So if he's asking for a normative justification for the account, like the position the person has, it doesn't make sense. It's just a sort of ill-formed question. Conversely, if it's a sort of causal explanation, okay, well, what caused you to oppose stealing, to have a disapproval, to disapprove of stealing? I don't know why I'm stumbling over my words so much today. Well, whatever account they give is irrelevant. They could just say, I don't know. That wouldn't somehow undermine the position, and it certainly would make it circular. So, in short, if the dialogue he outlines does not show that subjectivism is circular, because the subjectivist would point out that the question is ambiguous. Once you disambiguate the question, if the question is asking you something about your justification for the preference, then it's a sort of category error or ill-formed question. It's a question that doesn't really make sense on the subjectivist view. And so the subjectivist is under no obligation to be able to provide a satisfactory answer in the sense that they're not required to give an answer that would be conditional on subjectivism not being true. Conditional on them being true, the question doesn't really make a lot of sense. On the other hand, if you're asking about a causal explanation for why they have the view, then whatever answer they give would be irrelevant. They could give an answer, they could say they don't know, and it would have nothing to do with the legitimacy of the position. It certainly wouldn't be required to justify the position. They could just say, I don't know, and that would in no way undermine subjectivism or show that it's circular. Okay, so this claim that his attempt to rule out subjectivism has not worked. It's not circular.
To a similar pattern of circularity to the one that I described earlier pertaining to objectivity. And you might hear an answer to the effect of, okay, well, murder is wrong because it's causing unjust harm to another person. But this doesn't actually answer the question. It just defers the what without answering the why. Okay, well, why is causing harm to another person actually wrong? Because I think it is, right? And that's ultimately what relativism boils down to. So we can go ahead and cross out the existence of subjective morality.
Yeah, so he hasn't really shown that subjectivism, that you could rule that out.
As well, because it's completely incoherent. But let's move on to the neither option.
Well, it's certainly not incoherent. So, I had mentioned that I started talking about the typical analytic account. So the typical analytic account of subjectivism would be one according to which your desires give you reasons to perform certain sorts of actions. And so if you were having a dialogue with a subjectivist that endorses that kind of view, then they would say something like, look, the fact that I desire this is what gives me a reason. So that would be an account that they could offer for what they're doing. That wouldn't be anything particularly circular about it. Whereas I offer a more deflated account where I get rid of reasons. This is really irrelevant for me to get into. But again, you're just going to bottom out in some sort of descriptive claim that really, I don't understand what was supposed to be circular about subjectivism, regardless of whether we're talking about a more robust analytic subjectivism that takes the notion of normative reason seriously, or a more eliminativistic or quietistic account like my own that gets rid of them. So maybe that's something that we could talk about if he wants to have an exchange with me about this. All right, let's keep going. I don't want to make this video too long.
Right? Like, what if somebody were to say, okay, well, there's no objective standard for morality, but there's no subjective standard either. In fact, there is no standard for morality whatsoever. But the problem with this worldview is that it's literally self-defeating. You're objectively claiming that there is no objective standard whatsoever. So
yeah, no, you're not. So if you deny that there are any objective moral truths or any subjective moral truths, that position itself is not a first order moral claim. So meta-ethical positions of objectivity and subjectivity are positions on the status of first order moral claims, claims like stealing is wrong or it's good to help strangers, that sort of thing. So you could imagine there being a set, like it, or you could, in fact, you could picture a box. There's a box, and then all the first order moral claims are in the box. Whatever meta-ethical position you take is a position on the characteristics of whatever is in that box. So if you're a moral realist or an objectivist, what you think is the moral facts in that box, what makes them true is something other than our stances or attitudes or preferences, or the agreement of groups or something like that. Whatever it is that makes the statements in that box true, it's not our attitudes. It's not our stances. Whereas if you endorse, say, a subjectivist view, an individual subjectivism like what he describes, what you would think is that whatever is in that box is made true by our subjective preferences. So then this would allow moral claims to be true or false relative to the standards of different individuals. But it only refers to the objects in the box, not statements outside of the box. And that includes meta-ethical positions themselves. So the meta-ethical position, morality is subjective, is not itself a claim that is necessarily intended to be true or false in a subjective way. The position does not apply to itself. And this is also true of moral objectivism. So he's just made a mistake here. These positions do not apply to themselves. And if you think that morality is neither objective nor subjective, that's a position about the status of what's in the box. You would say, okay, the first order moral claims in that box, they're neither objective nor subjective. But that position is not a position about itself. It's not a position that holds that the position itself is neither objective or subjective. So this is just a straightforward mistake that he's made here. I don't even know that there's really any coming back from that. So for instance, let's say that you are an emotivist. I'm not saying emotivism is true, but if you're an emotivist, the position would be something like first order moral claims, or if you want to interpret a claim as a proposition inherently, apparent first order moral claims, utterances of the form, stealing is wrong, lying is wrong, that sort of thing. Those claims actually just express emotions. They might look like they are expressing some sort of proposition that could be true or false. In other words, they look like they're truth-apt, but they're not actually truth-apt. They're actually just expressions of emotions. Emotivism doesn't require you to be an emotivist about the claim that emotivism is true, because emotivism is a claim about what people are doing when they say things like stealing is wrong and lying is wrong. It's not a position on what people mean when they say things like emotivism is true. You're not required to think that means emotivism. Yay. So again, meta-ethical positions are not like self-referential. They don't apply to themselves. And so there's no contradiction or problem at all in saying morality is neither objective nor subjective.
The nihilistic perspective is absolutely self-defeating and logically incoherent.
Yeah, it's not incoherent and it's not self-defeating. And he hasn't made a good case for that.
Therefore, by process of elimination, objective morality must logically exist. Thus, there must be an objective moral lawgiver, one that we might call God. However, there's still an important distinction to be made here. All this argument has done is determine that there actually is an objective standard by which we can derive these moral truths. We still have yet to determine what those moral truths actually are. But in so knowing that there actually is an objective standard, we can reach the conclusion that there must be an objective moral legislator for these objective moral laws. And this lawgiver must be transcendent of humans, in that if humans did not exist, the truth would still be true, right? Because objectivity simply means looking from the outside, right? These truths must have always been true. Otherwise, they wouldn't be truly objective.
That's not what objectivism typically means in meta-ethics. It's used in a few ways. But one of the common ways it tends to be used these days is roughly synonymous with moral realism. So it would mean something like the truth of moral claims is not determined by the standards of individuals or groups, something like that. So it's not about, I don't know what he means by it being external. And what was the other claim he made?
Lawgiver must be transcendent of humans, in that if humans did not exist, the truth would still be true, right? Because objectivity simply means looking from the outside, right? These truths.
Yeah, I don't know what that means, looking from the outside. That's obscure. So he could probably clarify this, because maybe he means stance independence. I don't know.
Truths must have always been true. Otherwise, they would.
Yeah, it also doesn't require them to always be true. So, imagine that the laws of laws of physics change over time, like the speed of light changes over time. Does that mean that there is at any given time no stance independent fact about what the speed of light is? No. And likewise, it's possible in principle for moral facts to be true independent of anybody's standards or attitudes or anything, but for those facts to change over time. Now, many moral realists may think that the moral facts, in addition to being stance independently true, are necessary. And they might think that they are unchanging. But that's not a requirement for objectivity or realism. Unless, of course, you're stipulating a conception of objectivity or realism that bakes that notion in. But even if you are, it's not just going to be the moral facts don't change. Because now you can imagine there being a single being that's eternal, that has certain sorts of preferences. The moral facts just are its preferences, and they never change. That's not going to give you realism. You're going to have these unchanging moral facts, but they're still just preferences. So there is a conceptual distinction there. And if you really want to have objectivity or realism, you need that stance independent component. Them never changing isn't going to cut it. So I both don't think it's adequate, and I don't think it's sufficient or a necessary condition, basically.
Wouldn't be truly objective. So the lawgiver must therefore be transcendent of time and space as well. So this lawgiver must be a supernatural being. Now, it's important to note that this argument does not seek to anthropomorphize the being whatsoever. We don't know if it's the Christian God, the Muslim God. We don't know what God it is, because we still don't know what those moral truths are. All we know is that there is an objective standard by which we can derive these moral truths. So I hope I was able to articulate my position well in this video. If you have any disagreements, agreements, concerns, fits of rage, fits of joy, I'd love to hear them in the comments down below. I love feedback. But yeah, other than that, I'll see you guys in the next one.
All right, cool. I like that this video, he says at the end he wants feedback. So here's my feedback. Yeah, I don't think that the arguments presented in this video are particularly persuasive, and I'd be happy to continue the discussion about it. All right, going to close that one out there. I rarely do these. Usually I do these as a live stream, but I figured that this video would be so short that there wouldn't be a whole lot of reason to do that. So yeah, I'll leave it there, and I will see you all later. Please like and subscribe. I'll put a link to that video in the description for this video. So go over there and check that video out. Give it a like if you like the video. If you leave a comment over there, do be kind, be pleasant. Don't be obnoxious. So yeah, the standard stuff that I say about that sort of thing. But everybody take care.